In this section, we'll discuss the Indian Wars that happened out west after the Civil War. Our essential question is, how did westward expansion affect Native American populations? So we know whenever we began our study of American History 1, the entirety of the North and South American continents were settled by Native American tribes. This map over here shows us, we see some of the names that we're familiar with: Creek, Sioux, the Crow, Shoshone, where those tribes primarily lived. We also know that Native Americans and white settlers had different ideas about land ownership. Native Americans believed land belonged to everyone and could not be owned, while white settlers believed in private ownership, that they could fence off an area of land and they are the only ones who have ownership rights of that land. So the basis of conflict between the two groups, the white settlers and the Native Americans, historically had always been over land. It would not be any different during the Indian Wars following the Civil War. So reservation policy had been the United States policy regarding Native Americans for most of the 1800s. Reservations were tracts of land set aside solely for Native American use. Oklahoma Territory was a state-sized reservation that was put aside for Native American use until we saw in the last unit it was opened up for white settlers in 1889. As more white settlers moved west, reservations became smaller and smaller as land became scarce, especially if precious metals like gold or silver were discovered on land that was set aside for Native Americans. They would be forced onto different land, usually in a smaller size. These reservations were made by treaties and executive orders, and even though we had promised certain Native American tribes certain pieces of land, in the latter half of the 1800s we'll see those treaties being broken as that land is needed for white settlement. Another way that we attempted to force Native Americans to give up their land and settle on reservations was destruction of the buffalo. Great Plains Indians such as the Sioux depended on the buffalo for survival. They used every part of the animal. Their hide was used for teepees and clothing. They use the meat to eat. We'll see a picture on the next slide that shows what all of the parts were used for. However, as a strategy to subdue the Native Americans out west, the United States government began a program of killing as many buffalo as possible. As people traveled out west, they were encouraged to kill every buffalo that they came in contact with. So white settlers killed them for sport. They also killed them for their hides, which they sold back east, and left the rest of the buffalo to rot. The American buffalo was driven almost to extinction. At the end of the Civil War, we estimate there were about 30 million buffalo roaming wild. And that number slowly dwindled into the hundreds by the end of the century. Whenever Native Americans lost their means of survival, which was the buffalo, they were forced onto reservations in order to survive. We see here, this is a stack of buffalo skulls that these people are obviously very proud to have gathered. So whenever we say that the Native Americans used every part of the buffalo for survival, that is not an overstatement. You can pause and read all of the various uses if you would wish. But even when it came to their dung, their poop, that was used for campfires and to send smoke signals. So even their excrement was used for Native American purposes. The buffalo was also spiritual to the Native American. It was seen as a sacred being that provided them with their livelihood. So the end of the buffalo was not only the end of like their physical survival, it was also a huge blow to morale for the Native Americans who depended on the buffalo. We consider the start of the Indian Wars of the West to be the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. This occurred in Colorado Territory before it was a state. The Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians who lived at Sand Creek had approached a U.S. Army general and asked for assistance for their tribes. They were promised that they would be safe at Sand Creek because that was land that had been set aside for Native Americans. However, U.S. troops shortly arrived afterwards and brutally murdered about 400 unarmed Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians, most of which were women and children. It was a really brutal massacre. There were reports of the U.S. soldiers using infant children, basically as target practice, just firing bullets into them. Native Americans who were fleeing were shot and killed. Native Americans who were begging for mercy were murdered in cold blood. And it's regarded as the beginning of the Indian Wars because as word spread about the Sand Creek Massacre, many Native American tribes in the West began to band together to retaliate against the U.S. government. The colonel who gave the commands at the Sand Creek Massacre, a man named John Milton Chivington, said, "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice." So that shows you his attitude towards Native Americans, that he was happy to murder them, believed that it was his sacred duty. This colonel also proudly displayed his scalp collection taken from the people he murdered at the Sand Creek Massacre as a source of pride. An interpreter that lived in the Sand Creek village testified, "They were scalped, their brains knocked out. The men used their knives, ripped open women, clubbed little children, knocked them in the heads with their rifle butts, beat their brains out, mutilated their bodies in every sense of the word." So following the Sand Creek Massacre, there was going to be a period of intense fighting between white settlers, the U.S. Army, and Native American tribes in the West. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was drawn up in 1868 as an attempt to stop the hostilities. It promised land and hunting rights in the Black Hills to the Sioux Indians. However, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was not long after broken whenever gold was discovered in the area and white settlers rushed in to mine that gold. So the Battle of Little Bighorn occurred in 1876. After the Treaty of Fort Laramie was broken. The Native American leaders were Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and they had gathered their fighters in the Black Hills of South Dakota. A man named George Custer led the U.S. troops against the Sioux and the Cheyenne. Native Americans. He was given the order to scout out the area and find the encampment of the Sioux and Cheyenne, and report it back and wait for backup to attack the settlement. However, George Custer was a proud man. He believed that his men and technology was superior enough to take on the Sioux on his own. So him and his 200 men launched an attack on this encampment of the Sioux and Cheyenne. It was 200 U.S. troops up against 3,000 Native Americans. They didn't realize that they had found the main encampment and would be so outnumbered. And as a result, Custer and his troops were slaughtered. This became known in the East as Custer's Last Stand, and it is the primary victory of the Native Americans in the Indian Wars. It would also be their last major victory. The Nez Perce were another tribe that attempted to stand up against the U.S. troops. They lived in Idaho, and they were forced off their land whenever gold was discovered. They were asked to give up about 90% of the land that they inhabited. So, under the leadership of Chief Joseph, they fled to Canada to avoid capture by the U.S. troops. Troops pursued them for 1,700 miles until they finally caught up to them and forced the Nez Perce to surrender. They were then relocated to Oklahoma, where approximately half of the tribe died from both disease and despair following their relocation. Chief Joseph said, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." The Ghost Dance was a religious movement that caught on towards the end of the Indian Wars. It was brought about by a vision of a Native American leader that by practicing the dance, it would encourage the reemergence of the buffalo to the plains, that the Native Americans would get all of their land back in the West, and the white man would be completely gone from their lands. The ghost dance quickly spread among the surviving tribes, who practiced this dance with frenzy and enthusiasm. And the white settlers were afraid that this would lead to an Indian uprising. They were obviously not scared of this vision coming true, that they would disappear from the earth, but they were afraid that it might bring Native American tribes together and that they would continue to fight back against the white settlers. The Sioux leader Sitting Bull, who had survived up to this point by cooperating with U.S. troops, was killed because of fears that he would join the movement and be a leader that would bring Native American tribes together. The Wounded Knee Massacre is considered the end of the Indian Wars in the West. It occurred in 1890. A group of Sioux Native Americans were sent to the Wounded Knee Reservation in South Dakota, and U.S. troops demanded that the Sioux surrender all of their weapons. The Sioux intended to comply with this demand. However, a gun accidentally went off, we believe maybe by a Sioux that was deaf and misinterpreted the leader's command to surrender as a command to fire. And after that one gunshot, almost all of the 300 Sioux Indians that were at Wounded Knee were killed. We can see here in this picture a mass grave for the Native Americans who lost their life at Wounded Knee. And we consider this the end of the Indian Wars. There would not be any major resistance led by Native Americans after the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Most Americans were unsympathetic or indifferent to the plight of the Native Americans. However, some were critical. One outspoken critic of the U.S. government was Helen Hunt Jackson, who published a book that outlined the series of broken treaties and promises that the U.S. government had made with various Native American tribes. So she wrote about the massacres, the way that Native Americans had been mistreated throughout American history, and how they had been forcibly removed from their land. Following the Indian Wars, the U.S. government followed a policy of assimilation. They hoped to convert Native Americans to a white way of life so that they could exist peacefully with the white settlers. In doing so, they forced young Indian children to attend boarding schools. At these boarding schools, they were forced to cut their hair. They changed their clothes to a more traditional, well, whenever I say traditional, I mean a traditional white way of dressing. They forbade the use of their native languages and religions, and also stripped them of their given name and forced them to adopt more white Christian names. So through this boarding school policy, they attempted to Americanize these Native American children. Some went on to successfully assimilate into white society, but many of them were left in a situation of not fitting in with white society because they were Native American, but also being ostracized from their tribes and families because they could no longer speak the language, no longer practice the customs of their tribes, and were left really with no place where they were accepted for who they were. The U.S. government also moved away from reservation policy with the Dawes Severalty Act, which was passed in 1887. So this attempted to give Native American families 160 acres of land out west, so stopped treating them collectively as a tribe and tried to force them into like the family unit that was popular in European society. However, they did not provide them with education for farming, which was critical to farming in the dry climates of the West. So many of them were unsuccessful with the land that they were given. They were also not allowed to sell the land for at least 20 years, so many of them were not able to profit off of the land. The Dawes Severalty Act also allowed Native Americans to become American citizens after 25 years. So this was another attempt to assimilate the Native Americans. However, because it was such a widespread failure, the Dawes Severalty Act was done away with by the 1930s.